So our final speaker is Manjari Mahajan, who's an assistant professor of international affairs at the New School. Her work lies at the intersection of science and technology studies, development studies, and anthropology, with research and teaching on topics ranging from the ecologies and politics of data production for development and health, politics of expertise, philanthropic capitalism, intellectual property, social and economic rights, and other topics. Her empirical focus has been on India and South Africa, and more recently on global organizations such as the Gates Foundation, and the influence it exerts on global health, not only through its financial clout, but also through shaping knowledge platforms and metrics. She's the author of the forthcoming book entitled Constituting Global Health, Expertise and Emergency in the AIDS Epidemics of India and South Africa. And her next book is on how global health agendas are being shaped by philanthropic organizations in the United States. Before joining the New School, she had a 2-year postdoc fellowship from the Social Science Research Council and the Institute for Public Knowledge here at NYU. She's on the faculty advisory board of the India-China Institute at the New School. She received her PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell in 2008 and holds a Master's in Science and Science Policy from SPRU at Sussex University and her BA from Harvard. She's going to speak about the epistemologies and logics of new non-state actors, which have an outsized influence on the global realm of health data. And I think we'll hear a little bit about data politics as well. So Manjari, welcome.
Thank you to Meg and Sukti for inviting me. I'm very aware that in many ways mine is going to be a much more academic and boring presentation compared to the previous panelists, but I do think there are very common themes that run through different scales that we'll be discussing here. So I think as is evident, data collection and measurement are never an innocent matter, where as it were the facts speak for themselves. What is measured, who finances and does the measuring, how data are collated, interpreted, and dispersed, how they are harnessed to decision-making and program implementation, how other ways of collecting information are displaced. All these are contested matters because they are linked with the specific orientation of institutions and policies, the outcomes that they aspire to, and the forms of knowledge that they privilege. So the other panelists here have examined how data has been used in local, community, and national contexts. My work examines some of similar themes that they discuss, but really it focuses on the production of metrics and data at the level of global institutions and how there is a kind of transformation taking place in data ecologies in the world of international development and global health. There are emerging data ecologies which are marked by new actors, new techniques, and new ethics. These new data ecologies are producing a particular politics of knowledge production, of how we should know the world, and of governance, how we should be acting in the world, which has profound implications on inequalities between countries in the North and the South, where the asymmetries are manifested not simply in material terms, rich countries versus poor countries, but also really in epistemic terms. So it's kind of a fancy way of saying that who has the power to produce knowledge and represent people around the world. The emerging data ecologies are marked by a plurality of actors that include, of course, state governments, but also private corporations, and increasingly and very prominently, non-profit organizations that are funded by philanthropic foundations and public-private partnerships. This last category of actors, public-private partnerships and non-profit organizations funded by foundations, bring to the forefront certain kind of confounding questions of accountability and transparency. Because how do you think of ethics and democratic accountability of players that don't fall into our old familiar binaries of public versus private, of profit versus non-profit? And that's one of the things that I really want to try and get to about this kind of ethics that is demanded by new institutional formations that are coming to the fore. So these emerging data ecologies, while apparent in many sectors, are starkly evident in the arena of global health that I study. A vivid illustration is found in the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, IHME is how I'm going to refer to it, which is at the University of Washington in Seattle in the United States. This is a strikingly well-resourced institute, having received funding of around $1 billion over the last decade, much of it from the Gates Foundation. The IHME has a signature product. It's called the Global of Burden Disease Study, which is an enormous endeavor in epidemiological modeling. And so this Global Burden of Disease Study, in effect, is an attempt to provide a health audit of the entire world. It collects morbidity and mortality data from countries around the world, runs it through very complex models, and produces estimates on health trends of diseases, injuries, risks by age, sex, population over time. So the IHME underlines, correctly so, the unprecedented amount of data that it uses to produce its Global Burden of Disease study. The emphasis on the enormity of data is matched by a breathless narrative about the computational and modeling complexity of its work. To produce its estimates, the IHME does not rely exclusively on national statistics. From the outset, the IHME has pointed out that these national data are incomplete and often of very poor quality. Therefore, it actively seeks out several other data sources, including aid organizations, surveys, scientific literature, insurance companies, hospitals, and much more. So this heterodox approach of where all it collects data from stands in contrast with the traditional reliance of the United Nations, the World Bank, and other intergovernmental agencies on national statistics. So here there is a plural understanding of data at work which is complementing and sometimes outright replacing an older notion of national statistics. In a very short period of time, the IHME and its Global Burden of Disease study have become enormously influential in global health. Increasingly, the GBD, the Global Burden of Disease study, has become a default source of global health metrics for donors, for academics, for international agencies, and also for some governments. This study has had tectonic effects on an older landscape of production of global health metrics, because it has overwhelmed, sidelined, and co-opted older actors such as the World Health Organization and UNICEF that used to have a monopoly and the credible authority on producing global health trends. By collecting pluralistic and piecemeal data from a slew of private and public sources, the IHME has also undermined the credibility of national statistical systems. Indeed, for the weakest of national statistical offices, this unleashing of technology in statistics at a global level portends their growing irrelevance and disempowerment. There's no way they can even understand this language. The IHME, by bypassing national statistical offices and by providing alternative sources of statistics that is increasingly becoming hegemonic, may very well be compromising the long-term viability of the infrastructure that is needed for national statistical production. So there's a kind of irony here that a lot of what's being criticized by some of the other panelists is national statistical production, but at a global level, in poorer countries, that's exactly what is also being compromised and undermined. And in the longer term, it may very well be more deeply entrenching the data silences from poorer parts of the world. The impact of the IHME reflects overall trends of more plural epistemic practices and the relative diminishing importance of national governments and intergovernmental agencies in producing data that are manifest in many other sectors of international development. So as such, the IHME serves as a useful lens through which to think through questions of accountability in the realm of global metrics production. Who are the experts and who are the publics who should hold data and their purveyors accountable? Are these experts and publics supported and funded? To what ends is this accountability important? I just want to take the last couple of minutes to suggest that the accountability of data at a global level can be conceptualized at least at two levels. First, perhaps, should be a proximate accountability that entails evaluation by what I'm calling domain experts who can determine the technical quality of the numbers and the methodology employed. Peer review would be an example of a certain kind of technical accountability. A second level of accountability would have to include assessment by a wider-ranging realm of publics and experts that can weigh in on the broader work that the metrics are doing. These experts may not be conversant with the technical complexities of metrics production and yet be in a crucial position to assess the political, social, and epistemological origins and impacts of metrics. Such commentary is necessary to analyze if the presented metrics are answering the most relevant questions, as we have been hearing, how they are shaping knowledge about poverty and development, how they are affecting communities, institutions, and policymaking. Development metrics, after all, don't stay in data labs. They're intended to travel into diverse policy, social, and political realms. Correspondingly, it is crucial that the relevant experts that hold metrics accountable not be confined to specialized domain experts, but extend to a broader community invested in that data. In the case of the IHME, accountability at both levels has been relatively elusive. This has not been because of the Institute's malintent or profit-seeking motives. The reasons are more complex. Peer reviews are constrained as it is difficult for journals to find reviewers who are expert enough and independent enough, with hurdles posed by the complexity of models and computing, protection of primary data under privacy agreements, and depleted capacities of international agencies, many of which self-censor themselves because they too receive funding from the Gates Foundation. As far as a broader level of accountability is concerned, few resources have been directed towards supporting social scientists, human rights groups, community groups who can study and comment on social and political meanings of the metrics. Here, the problem of the absence of transparency is not necessarily that the algorithms and models are not public, though that is part of the problem, but it is also really about a dearth of sovereign publics that have the resources and that can understand and freely comment on these data. What is at stake here is how we know the world of health, disease, poverty, and development around the world. The IHME is undoubtedly producing important science. However, it is facilitating a particular kind of knowledge production, which is presented as global knowledge. But here the global has very particular contours. It is typically produced in the metropolises of the North. It satisfies the needs of donors and global planners who need to make cross-country comparisons about cost-effective interventions. It potentially creates a situation where national governments' way of knowing their own populations is mediated via Seattle. Under the garb of neutral and scientific metrics, a global knowledge with systematic silences of data from poorer parts of the world becomes a universal way of knowing and acting upon the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as a few of the panelists have already alluded to, there's a lot of really interesting resonances, I think, among these different presentations. And I'd like to just give a moment to the panelists to respond to each other or pull out a thread that you might want to do before we open to the rest of the participants here. Jody, do you have anything you'd like to reflect on?
A comment, something that really struck out to me, you know, speaking about the actors, and I love the by, with, and for. I remember when I first came to the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building, and we were strategizing and talking about leaders and talking about empowerment and talking about communities. And one of the first things that I said to them is, when I start bringing community leaders inside of this room, they're gonna have maybe tattoos and gold teeth and You know, a lot of just the stereotypical labels that we use to criminalize, you know, people. So it blesses me to even see some of the partners here on this stage, how we recognize that the very actors, especially when you're shifting power and you're empowering marginalized communities, directly impacted communities, and you're taking these processes or developing the processes with these individuals, is the actors look a lot different than the elected officials and the people in power, but not taking for granted that these people are experienced, that we do have a narrative, that our voice is unheard, but we are capable of, when given opportunity and access, to be able to create and to design and stand behind what we believe in. So I think that is very important, especially when thinking about how to democratize data, is that when you're handing this over to communities, that we don't, you know, oppress and further oppress, but it literally is a process for all folks to get involved. And love what you said about it not being a smooth process. And that's one of the ways that I look at the community justice. And restorative justice, we typically bring odd bedfellows, is what we call them, together. And so when we have these oppressed neighborhoods and communities, and then bringing our elected officials and systems, and they're on two different roads, how do we bring them together to a space where it's not that we're all in relationship together, but we have a space to be able to communicate, share context, and be able to design together, to be able to look at how we can really shift and overcome some of these issues.
Thanks so much. Fika, would you like to add or reflect on anything?
Yeah, sure. What I find, so listening to also the fellow panelists, I think some of this has been echoed in the work people also in this room and outside of this room have been doing, where it's sort of like currently we live in states, in systems where sort of like the poor are being punished for being poor, but then these billionaires get to experiment on us in the wild without any accountability. So it's like whether it's the Gates Foundation or Omajar or like, I mean, Hewlett, there's so many very rich people who, with good intentions maybe, are experimenting in the wild. And I think this is also what you see in policing. There's a lot of experimentation happening in the wild, and there's no accountability for this, because if a project fails, it's just like a failure and we move on, and we never acknowledge that it actually has real life implications on people. And I'm very inspired by the example of James about how you can actually, as a community, stand up and push different priorities forward, because it is, you see it as well. It's like in your examples, in the examples I see in the Netherlands, it's like, so it's always different priorities that are pushing the agenda. So it's very inspiring to see this.
Thanks very much. James.
Kia ora, thank you. Look, probably three things, really. Thank you all, by the way. Awesome presentations. Three things. One, I'm a big believer of keeping it simple, particularly with the communities with whom I work. So to take all of this and to be able to present it as simply as possible is really important for me, which leads into my second point, which is really hearts and minds. These types of forum, for me, speak very much to the head, whereas a lot of our delivery is on my first slide on our marae, our cultural centres. There is a lot to be gained by speaking to the heart, and I liked some of what you shared before our talk around just being very centred in who we are, not only as individuals, but as collectives as well. And in that respect, my third point, I suppose, would be, you know, that old adage, think global, act local, you know, and we focus on ourselves. We don't compare ourselves to whomever, particularly within the New Zealand space. I'm always, my key example is, you know, we have a rising level of Māori language speakers now. That wasn't as a result of hammering at the state, hammering at government, who caused the decline in our language to start with colonisation. That started in the 70s with literally a group of Māori women elders, getting together and saying, we need to start lifting the language with our people. And so they just used to gather, their grandchildren together and start speaking the language. That has evolved now to, we have preschool Māori language nests kohanga reo throughout all of New Zealand. We have Māori primary schools. We have 3 tribal universities. And that just started with us doing, starting our little thing and just getting on and doing it, quite frankly, because the state ain't going to do it unless, sorry, excuse me. No, I'm not sorry. Yeah, those are my 3 points.
Thank you. Marjorie.
Thank you, Meg. There are many common themes, but the one that perhaps strikes me most is this imperative to address what are systematic silences and asymmetries in representing voices, bodies, experiences of certain peoples, whether they be racial communities within the United States, class, tribal, or entire countries when it comes to the global scene. Right? And I think we already have a set of strategies and interventions that are on the table, but I think one thing that really struck with me was something I think that Jody said, which was about, can we slow it down? And that, I think, for me is a really key idea, especially in this world of global health metrics that I study, which has been infused by a discourse of, computing and supercomputers and AI and big data and just all this GWiz, technoviz language, which can leave behind very quickly a whole set of actors. So I think thinking about ways in which time can be slowed down, can be punctuated to allow other groups to not catch up, but also potentially redefine what the problem is in their own terms would be crucial.
Thank you so much. So we'll open now, and just a couple of additional things that I've heard, and it's wonderful that already hands are going up. I love, Jody, the way you said that data can be incarcerating itself. That was beautifully articulated. Then also the strand of expertise and what counts as expertise, and Marjorie, you explicitly talked about that, but also I think implicit was the fact that people are the experts in their own experience, and that is often missing in the other forms of expertise that sort of governments and other powerful corporations, philanthropy, et cetera, often posit expertise as something completely different. And then I think this language around rigor and method we've got a really strong pushback on that in a very fruitful way, I think, and it's kind of a strand I think that we'll be talking about throughout the next 2 days as well. Plenty more, and I will now open to the floor. So I see 2 hands, and why don't we take 3 at a time? Okay, and I'm going to ask you to speak into here so that when we have the recording, we will actually hear your voice.
Yes, hey, good morning. Thank you to everybody. My name is Alexandra Lowe with the New York Democratic Lawyers Council. I particularly want to congratulate you, Ms. Polk, on the success of your referendum to re-enfranchise voters with a history of felony convictions. That's a wonderful victory. I wonder if you could just simply talk about 2 aspects of that and maybe where data comes in or doesn't. First of all, we've been reading that the governor and the legislature have been trying to slow down the implementation of your success. So is there anything you can say about whether you think that's still going to move forward effectively, and how Andrew Gillum's effort to not re-register, but register 1 million new voters in Florida, either how that relates to that effort or how he and these other campaigns are using data to try to do that? Because obviously voting is one of the key human rights, and very easy to disregard populations because many elected officials don't feel they owe them anything if they're not voting for them.
Thanks.
Thank you. So for me,
well, hi, my name is Beatriz Borges. I come from Venezuela, and I am a human rights defender and professor there. And we have I think the worst example about data, because we don't have any official data in my country about anything. And that's what the government used to hide the situation in a global arena. And from civil society, we have been doing so many work about collecting our own data by our own possibilities, and thus we can show to the international community how was the humanitarian emergency there. 3 years before, we have, after that, sorry, we have the recognition of the humanitarian situation in Venezuela by the international bodies. And my question is, we have these difficulties because we don't have any official data, and we do by ourselves with different methodologies, but I think could be sound contrary, but how we can use in this context when we don't have internet and light technology to help our world to improving data who can show the dimensions of the situation in our country.
Thank you. Brian. Sorry, I just already called on her. Yeah.
More of a reflection than a question, so I'm happy to keep this to the next round if that's more appropriate.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much for all the great panelists and the great interventions. I wanted to react to threads of data politicization and data silencing. My name is Mahinur Madrawi first, sorry, and I'm with the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I just wanted to share some thoughts about how this is very relevant to the area of the world where I come from. I'm from Egypt, and these are very prominent threats to the MENA region, and specifically what big players like the IMF and the World Bank have labeled ACT countries, or Arab countries in transition, and how important time and momentum is right after 2011, right after the Arab Spring has started. The IMF and the World Bank and the G20 jumped down the throats of those countries that are going through reforms because of issues of economic and social rights violation, but also civil and political, and have said, oh, well, we'll give you support for your democratic transition in return for open market policies. And now when we evaluate what's happening with these countries, what is being used is traditional macroeconomic indicators to say how well the social and economic conditions and rights are happening, and everything is being silenced and being kept in silo from civil and political rights violations. So looking at Egypt, for example, the IMF, Christine Lagarde somehow managed to make a statement on the anniversary of the revolution on January 25 to commend the Egyptian people's what did she say? Patience with the economic reforms that the IMF is engineering in Egypt. There's also sees very parallel patterns in the region. That is all based on the things like GDP growth, things like closing budget gaps, things like foreign exchange indicators, while indicators like that reflect how people's lives are really affected by such big economic patterns that the IMF and the World Bank is inscribing are being ignored. So there's no mention, for example, of poverty rates. There's no mention of real wage, and those kind of indicators that affect how people's lives are. So we've been working with a group of national Egyptian partners to develop alternative indicators. So we look at the alternative indicators across 6 issues. We're trying to look at labor, we're trying to look at health, education, food, water, and agricultural land issues. And we try to measure those by human rights standards. And so yeah, I just wanted to bring this pattern to the floor, and if anyone is interested to learn more about it, I've got little postcards about the initiative here.
Thanks very
A little bit of shameless self-advertising
No,
here,
thanks. Oh, that's a very helpful
Thank you.
contribution. Thank you. So Jody, we'll turn back to you.
So on the campaign to restore voting rights in the state of Florida, formerly incarcerated or people with felony convictions were permanently barred from voting. And the campaign to restore voting rights was a people's initiative where we were tasked with gathering over 1 million signed petitions from registered voters in Florida to be able to restore the voting right to those 1.4 plus million individuals. And so for me, coming into the campaign as a community organizer, I was obviously directly impacted as a person who had been in the Florida prison system. And two parts of the data that specifically stood out to me that I worked through my platform was who was the folks who were mostly impacted. I think for me, when thinking of convicted felons, it was this assumption that majority of those people were people of color, but a majority, over 65% of the individuals who were actually directly impacted were not people of color. And then also the data of showing that just who was voting and who were not voting was extremely important, because what I found when out on the trail of really getting registered voters on board was that there were a lot of people who could vote who were just not voting. There were a lot of people of color who were not voting simply because their family members could not vote, and a lot of distrust. A lot of people just did not have faith in the system, faith in the actors of the system, in government, local government. A lot of people didn't even understand how government worked and how government actually influenced, our day-to-day needs and spaces. So for me as an organizer, there were definitely two lanes. I mean, the registered voter, who were mostly older people, non-people of color, it was just the right thing to do. It was almost like a simple conversation, but it also amazed me as an organizer. It was almost like the Me Too movement of incarceration, of just how many people of various ages, various color dynamics would literally come up to me and whisper of them having an incarceration or their family member being impacted by incarceration. So now that we are at the other side of it, where we were able to get the amendment passed, there are some challenges now around new voters being able to vote and how the financial portion of your sentence and how that plays in. And for me, it's very simple. When you're looking at someone on the other side of a felony conviction, and specifically in Florida, where we acknowledge the minimum mandatory, the excessive financial penalties that are attached to convictions, it's just another way, in my opinion, of keeping certain people from being able to vote. Because when you look at even that small number or percentage of people of color who are directly impacted, the ability to actually pay those excessive fees where every other part of your conviction had been taken care of is just pretty outrageous. And then again, we are now depending on individuals and actors and officials to make a decision who have no cultural understanding or have any understanding of just how that plays in. So for me, I'm very much looking forward to the registered voters who showed up during that time to continue to stay with us. I have made some of the most amazing relationships just on that trail, on that campaign, and very much surprised me on how with the data, it's easy to classify people in groups, but when you have that one-on-one and you're approaching and you're talking to people, like we talk about systems, but when you're actually interacting with the people within those systems, when you're actually up close and talking, again, the data did not reflect the true reality of the intent, the hearts, and the minds of the people, not just directly impacted, but also those registered voters. So it's definitely still a process And it is an amazing process, and even though it's not smooth, just really looking forward to see how the registered voter and the partnerships that we were able to create during Amendment 4, how they continue to carry on between this process. And it really has a lot, in my personal opinion, as someone from these neighborhoods, someone who's directly affected, that we really begin to educate our systems, and just the folks who influence these systems are so far removed from our neighborhoods. They're not in the prison system, they're not in the workplace, they're not in the schools, they're not in the neighborhoods. And so to now have to depend on these folks to help make decisions definitely needs to be a lot of education on the local level, and that's why I do appreciate what Mr. Gillum is doing, so that individuals aren't just carting people out to vote. We see the same campaigns around the same times coming around, the same people that you never seen before. So one of the strategic ways that I'm looking at this is how can we educate continually? How do we make the links between the day-to-day issues that we see inside of community with elected officials, with the official process, in a way that community members and people who are directly impacted aren't just voting, aren't just stepping up because activists and community leaders came in your neighborhood and told you to, but because we recognize that through voting is a strategic way for us to be able to get our needs met, but also be able to define those needs and have some real conversations about the people that we put into place to be able to get those needs met.
Thanks, Jody. I'm consciously going to go to 45, just because we do have a break right now, but we promise to give you a bit of a moment for coffee. James or Fika, would you like to respond to any of the comments?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Perhaps based on our experience, this is with respect to the Venezuelan question. Yeah, based on our experience, I can share a few thoughts. First and foremost, what came to me is sovereignty starts with the self, at least in my opinion. And we basically started with what we had, And in that respect, I really do now value the role of framing and frameworks, particularly when we bring together, our communities and we just start again. Who are we? Who do we think we are? Where do we want to go? And why are we even doing this? And then when all of that is pulled together into a future vision, that in and of itself starts, that does something. Because in the where do we want to go comes the what do we need to do to get there. And it's in the actual doing that's where we can identify where the data is, or at least have identified to our communities. Did you know that register there is data? Did you know that is data? Did you know that list there is data, and it's our own data? And again, so just start pulling that together. And that's all we've done, really. And as smaller tribes or communities, we've stayed connected with each other and shared learnings on that, to the point that now we do have, some of us have these really robust, databases, that are useful. And so the key thing to that is government wants that, because it's useful. And as was shared earlier, they don't have it, and we might be open to sharing that, but let's sit down and talk about what that might look like. And how can that benefit all of us? Because let's be clear, we got this off our own back, And so the other thing my last thing around that has been to it is really key to have those in our communities who have experience around this, because not only is it around identifying, the importance of admin data and what have you, but it's embedding within some of these developmental activities building data capability, and what have you. And it doesn't always need to be, yes, there is the statistical elements of that, and what have you, but it's just as much around governance, it's just as much around ethics, it's just as much around technology, and what have you. We've got some cool initiatives going with, collecting, people staying connected, just on phones and stuff. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you. Fika?
I don't have that much to add. I think it's very great what you're talking about. I think I do want to acknowledge that currently the Venezuelan situation is very problematic, and I think it's maybe in this time where it's like, what do we have and where do we want to go? In sort of the current constraints that are there, because as you said, there are like blackouts happening, there's like unrest, there's food shortage, there's all of the stuff happening at the moment. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that it is a very difficult situation.
Okay. There were two hands that I saw in particular, and I'd love to just invite you to speak very briefly. They're up here, Brian. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sun Ping. I'm a visiting scholar at the U.S. Asia Law Institute here in NYU Law School. My question is very simple. Does because I'm come from China, so I'm interested in the power of police. Does the GDPR limit the power of the police to collect and use personal data?
I'm Sakiko Fugudapa from the New School. I just have a very quick question to James. You managed to work with the National Statistical Office. So, I mean, I think that's a real challenge in terms of making a difference, in a sense that it's to actually, you know, do something, I mean, shift that dependence on all of those other methods. So how did you actually achieve that? And is this something that's possible in a country like New Zealand, and that may be less possible in a resource-poor, aid-dependent country where government offices are much more dependent on external funding?
And I think we're going to stop it there because of the time. But I'll also broaden Sakiko's question. I think that's a fantastic question, and it also, others might relate to it if we just ask the question, how can these alternative data sets become powerful? Sometimes it's through working with national statistical offices, and there might be other ways, and I'd love to hear other thoughts on how to make alternatives powerful as well. But James, do you want to start with that, since that was directed at you?
Sorry, responding to that question?
Yeah, whichever though. And then I think what we'll do is just come down the table.
Sorry, could you repeat your question again?
So my question is, how can you make alternative data powerful? Is it always working with national statistical offices or official data, or sometimes are there other strategies for that?
Okay. I'd say stay connected with each other, whomever that might be they the alternative. Again, the slide that I showed of our very first gathering, we are all active in our respective communities, building, developing, but once we connect and then show not only the National Bureau of Statistics, but also the government, that this is who we are, this is what we've got, this is what we're going to do, that's quite a powerful, that's quite a powerful force. However, I do acknowledge that New Zealand is a small country. We have a degree, and we also do have the Treaty of Waitangi that we can leverage off as a people. So that does provide both a degree of agility, and also we've got some legal basis, which is just not available in other jurisdictions. So, but there is definitely strength in numbers and connection, I would say.
Definitely echoing James. I think it's just so important to, especially with alternative data, hand it over to the folks who are most directly impacted around the data that's being collected, being used, looking at ways to create space within their neighborhoods, within their spaces, versus always inviting them outside and connecting and building that relationship. One of the things that James said earlier that just really stuck out is when you're really empowering these neighborhoods, communities, classes of people, it doesn't just impact them. it impacts the larger community, the larger space. So any alternative data practices that is leading to communities and spaces being all inclusive with all people participating creates, you know, just more opportunity, more access, more alternatives, more vision, more solution. So definitely connecting, definitely making that space to really include individuals, and how do we relate and how do we all move together.
I'll just respond to the GDPR question. So what is interesting about the GDPR is that it's the European data protection legislation. It's that it gives citizens rights and sort of avenues for action, and it gives the data protection authorities in every country sort of more power to do stuff, to fine or... so the police is not governed under the GDPR. I think this is the best kept secret, is that at the same day as the GDPR, the police directive also came into in force, which is the data protection legislation for the European police forces. This has not been transposed in every European country, so some countries are lagging still, and it's also been transposed differently in European countries, where certain DPAs, certain countries have said the DPA will get as much power over the police as they will get over commercial companies, for instance, and other countries have said we'll keep them separate and we'll give the DPA some authority, but only little authority. So what will remain is, it still has to be seen in practice what actually will be the impact of the police directive, also because it's very unknown, and the DPAs, they're still struggling, also, I think, also with how to approach this. And as a citizen, you also have different rights under the police directive than you have under the GDPR.
To Meg's question, which also indirectly addresses Sakiko's question about how to give authority to alternative data. So I would echo what Jody said about having spaces where there can be discussion, there can be other ways of framing the problem and defining the problem, but also I think it's important that these, over a period of time, become institutionalized spaces so that they are not vulnerable to the vagaries of the politics of the moment. And that these institutionalized spaces have certain rubrics for representation within them, democratic representation within them, so that they don't easily get co-opted by the new big game in town. And today in global health forums it might be Gates, tomorrow it might be USAID, day after it might be something else. So some rubrics of democratic representation in institutionalized spaces that allow for plural conceptualizations of what counts as a problem about which you then want to collect data. So not coming at the level of, well, how does the data get used, but actually starting much more upstream in problem definition, which then leads to data collection, categorization, and so on. The second piece I think that is crucial is that of resources, and having some ethical distribution and availability of resources, not just understood as financial resources, but also resources in terms of education, technology, tools of governance, and technologies of governance. Because otherwise, it can just be very disempowering to have these spaces having great discussions, as was perhaps really illustrated in the case of the Sustainable Development Goal discussions. But then if the resource part of the equation is left completely unaddressed, then all those good intentions can very easily be captured or just wither away.
I'd like to thank the panelists again. I think there's a lot of really rich concepts, thoughts, questions also that will be really woven through the next 2 days. So thank you for setting us off on the right track.